General Hospital will reveal after enduring a long and humiliating night behind bars, one that reeked of urine, stale air, and the echo of metal clanging with every movement, Tracy stepped out of the holding cell not as the indomitable matriarch of the Courtroom family, but as a woman betrayed and abandoned. She didn't walk out with dignity. She limped, her once elegant designer heels soaked in her own blood from blistered feet, her shimmering evening gown now crumpled and smeared with dust, dried tears, and remnants of the concrete floor on which she had slept. The gown had been chosen with care, intended to make a grand statement at the nurses' ball, a night of grace and celebration, but instead it bore witness to her disgrace. And she had no one waiting for her. No Yuri with his loyal strength, no Jason with his dependable silence. There was no one from the Courtroom mansion to greet her, no call from Michael, no message from anyone. But the silence that hurt most came from Carly. Carly, the woman who had once looked her in the eyes and called her family, who had shared drinks with her, argued with her like a daughter, and laughed like a sister, had known the truth all along and said nothing. She had let Tracy rot in a cell, publicly shamed and emotionally gutted, while protecting Drew, the man Tracy now knew had orchestrated her downfall. Every painful step Tracy took from the police station back to her estate was accompanied by a loop of torturous memories, a re-examination of every recent event. The discovery of ketamine in her vehicle, the inexplicably swift issuance of the arrest warrant, and Mac's tip-off from Drew, it all formed a neat, airtight narrative. Too neat. Too clean. Too convenient. And Tracy, seasoned by years of boardroom battles, corporate espionage, and family betrayals, saw the fingerprints of manipulation all over it. But what Drew hadn't counted on was that Tracy had sources of her own, sources that operated in shadows and corridors where no security camera dared linger. She had employed an ex-security contractor from General Hospital months earlier, a man discreetly loyal to her, who had audio recordings and surveillance data that painted a far different picture. Portia had met with Drew on multiple occasions in the hospital's service corridor, where they'd whispered about timelines, chemical access, and how Tracy would be the perfect scapegoat to remove an obstacle to their collective ambitions. And now Tracy had in her possession the tapes, the transcripts, and the testimonies. She had a file thick enough to bury Drew, and she was prepared to use every inch of it. But her fury didn't burn hottest for him, it was for Carly. Carly's silence, her betrayal by omission, had broken something inside Tracy. In her mind, Carly had weighed truth and justice against her loyalty to Drew and chosen the latter. To Tracy, that silence wasn't just cowardice, it was cruelty dressed as pragmatism. Carly had let her fall alone, and now Tracy would rise alone, and destroy everyone who thought she wouldn't. She began laying the groundwork meticulously. Tracy hired a formidable legal team, one well-versed in both criminal defense and corporate warfare. She prepared to file criminal charges of defamation and malicious prosecution against Drew, including her carefully documented evidence of Portia's involvement. Witness statements from a retired medical records technician, corroborating Drew's unauthorized access to medical files to fabricate circumstantial evidence, were added to the stack. Tracy's legal strategy wasn't just to clear her name, it was to decimate Drew's. She wanted not just vindication, but retribution. But her ambitions didn't stop in the courtroom. Tracy, with precision and a deep sense of vengeance, turned her sights to Michael's custody battle with Willow. Publicly, she claimed to support Michael because he was a Courtroom, a young man needing stability for his children. Privately, her motives were more layered. This was her way of neutralizing Carly permanently. By aligning with Michael, Tracy could systematically erode the influence Carly had over him and ensure that the younger generation of Courtrooms would no longer be poisoned by Carly's morally ambiguous guidance. Tracy knew Michael had lingering doubts about his mother. Especially after learning of her history with Nina and the choices she made regarding Drew. These emotional cracks were all she needed. She widened them subtly but efficiently, reminding Michael through carefully constructed conversations that sometimes even those closest to us act in their own self-interest. With her reputation still intact among judges and legal circles, Tracy positioned herself as the key witness in both the child custody trial and the forthcoming criminal proceedings against Drew. She maneuvered like a general, ruthless, calculating, but always 3 steps ahead. When the courtroom doors finally opened, and the custody hearing commenced, Tracy entered with her head high and a burning resolve hidden beneath her pearls and tailored coat. She sat through the opening statements without flinching, letting her silence speak volumes. But when it was time to testify, she turned the entire proceeding on its head. She recounted everything in vivid detail: how Drew had plotted with Portia, how ketamine was smuggled and planted, how Mac was manipulated, and how Carly had known every piece of the puzzle and kept quiet. Her voice didn't tremble, it cut through the courtroom like a blade. Gasps echoed as she presented the audio evidence. Carly, seated just rows away, looked paralyzed. Her composure crumbled as realization dawned in the eyes of the judge, the jury, and worst of all, Michael. He looked at his mother, his protector, with a hollow stare. There was no outrage, just the cold shock of a child who sees for the first time the weakness of the person who raised him. Drew was immediately remanded for further investigation. Prosecutors announced they would re-examine every allegation tied to the ketamine case and Drew's alleged manipulation of medical records. Carly, disgraced, was asked to step away from any legal role in Michael's defense. And Tracy, having scorched the courtroom with truth and precision, left the courthouse a victor not just in legal terms, but in something more personal: reclamation of power, of dignity, and of vengeance. The aftermath rippled through Port Charles like a storm. Drew's career imploded. Carly found herself isolated from the Courtermains and slowly distanced by Michael, who now clung more tightly to Tracy. Even Willow, confused and bruised by the chaos, began to question everything. And amid it all, Tracy stood tall. Not triumphant in a gloating way, but resolute, like a woman who had been pushed into the dirt and had clawed her way back with sharpened nails and an iron will. Her eyes no longer sought validation, only control. She had proved to the world, and more importantly to herself, that even when abandoned, betrayed, and humiliated, she could not be broken. She was Tracy, and she had just rewritten the rules of loyalty and power in Port Charles. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension, a collective breath being held as Tracy entered with the regal command of a woman who had faced fire and refused to burn. Her presence alone silenced the whispers. Her tailored suit was as sharp as her gaze, her posture upright, impervious to the weight of betrayal that had brought her here. Each step echoed with intention. There was no trace of the disgrace she had endured just days before, no sign of the humiliation from her time behind bars. What stood before the court now was not a victim, but a tactician, a warrior cloaked in dignity and rage. Tracy took her seat without so much as a glance toward Carly, who sat rigid in the gallery, her face pale and tight with dread. Tracy said nothing during the initial proceedings, allowing her legal team to methodically unveil the evidence piece by piece: photographs, transcripts, surveillance logs, and the damning audio recordings. It was a slow, deliberate exposure of deceit, merciless, but precise. Tracy's restraint during this phase was cold and calculating. She allowed the courtroom to digest each detail in silence, every revelation a thread unraveling the tapestry of Drew's fabricated accusations and Carly's passive complicity. It was only when she was called to the witness stand, when she had the full attention of the judge, the jury, and the assembled families, that she let her composure ignite into fire. Her voice, though calm, had an edge that cut through the air like a blade. With steely precision, she recounted the sequence of events that led to her wrongful arrest, the conversations she had overheard, the patterns she had tracked, the pieces of information she had quietly compiled while others underestimated her. She revealed how Portia and Drew had met under the radar, plotting to position her as a liability that needed to be neutralized. She detailed the strategic use of ketamine. Chosen specifically for its notoriety, its association with illicit behavior, a drug designed to stain her reputation irreversibly. She even described the lengths Drew went to manipulate hospital records, how he altered timestamps and entered restricted systems using another physician's credentials. But it was when she turned her attention to Carly that the temperature in the room shifted from tense to explosive. She spoke of betrayal. Not with tears, but with the raw fury of a woman who had been stabbed in the back by someone she had once called family. Tracy explained, in damning clarity, how Carly had been aware of Drew's plan from the beginning. She had known about the meetings with Portia, about the planted evidence, and about the intended outcome. Yet Carly had chosen silence. She had chosen to let Tracy suffer, to let her be humiliated and imprisoned, all to protect Drew. And that silence, Tracy declared, was just as violent as the lie itself. At that moment, Carly, pale and trembling, attempted to interject, rising from her seat with hands clenched and lips parted to protest. But before she could say a word, the gavel slammed down with a deafening crack. The judge's voice rang out, firm and unyielding, ordering Carly to remain silent or risk contempt. Carly sank back down, her protest swallowed by the courtroom's mounting tension. She glanced toward Michael, her son, her legacy, and what she saw in his eyes shattered her. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't even disappointed. It was hollow. Confused. As though the foundation of everything he had believed about his mother had just been demolished in a matter of minutes. For the first time, Michael looked at Carly not as the woman who raised him, but as a stranger. What followed was a flurry of action. The judge, disturbed by the gravity of the evidence and the implications of legal tampering, ordered Drew to be taken into immediate custody pending a full criminal investigation. Court officers surrounded him, and without a word, Drew was led away in handcuffs, his expression stunned, the smirk he often wore now gone. The courtroom buzzed with a mix of disbelief and vindication. Simultaneously, the judge declared Carly an unreliable witness due to her withholding of critical information. This decision stripped her of any authority to act as a legal advocate for Michael, particularly in the custody proceedings that were still underway. The blow was devastating. Carly had gone from being the emotional pillar of the Corinthos family to a silenced figure whose words no longer held weight in a court of law. She was publicly discredited, and worse, privately rejected, her influence diminished in the eyes of her own son. The chaos continued as Sasha, visibly distressed while on the witness stand, suddenly clutched her abdomen and doubled over. A sharp cry echoed through the courtroom, and paramedics were called in. Sasha had gone into early labor, an unexpected turn that led the judge to temporarily suspend the proceedings. Yet even as the hearing was put on pause, the damage was done. Drew faced a bleak future of prosecution and possible imprisonment for conspiracy, defamation, and abuse of professional access. Carly, disgraced and disempowered, left the courthouse under the harsh gaze of former allies and the silence of her son, who now walked with Tracy, his loyalty shifting under the pressure of truth. Outside the courthouse, the sky had darkened, a fitting reflection of the storm that had just erupted within. Reporters clamored for statements, but Tracy said nothing. She walked past them with a calm that came not from joy, but from justice served. This victory wasn't about celebration. It was about restoration. She had clawed her way out of disgrace and emerged stronger, sharper, and more dangerous than ever. Carly had tried to silence her with omission, and Drew had tried to erase her with manipulation. But Tracy had returned the favor with precision, exposing every secret, every betrayal, and every cowardly alliance. And as she stood at the steps of the courthouse, her eyes scanning the Port Charles skyline, Tracy knew this wasn't the end. This was just the reckoning. Those who had dared to conspire against her would now learn that there were consequences to betraying a courtermain, especially one who had spent a lifetime surviving the treacherous politics of both family and power. Tracy had not only reclaimed her voice, she had weaponized it. And the echoes of her testimony would haunt the lives of Drew, Carly, and anyone else who thought they could bury her under a lie. As the heavy doors of the courthouse closed behind her, Tracy emerged into the daylight not merely as a victor, but as a woman reborn from the ashes of betrayal, humiliation, and calculated malice. The sun had barely pierced through the overcast sky, yet in that moment, it seemed to catch her figure with an almost celestial clarity, framing her not as someone who had survived a legal battle, but as someone who had conquered a war of power, reputation, and personal truth. The murmurs of reporters faded into static noise behind her, the cameras flashing like insignificant sparks, unable to capture the magnitude of what had just transpired inside those four walls. Because what Tracy had accomplished wasn't just the collapse of a fabricated case or the temporary imprisonment of Drew, it was the reclamation of dignity, respect, and identity in a world that had tried to strip all three away from her. The shareholders of the Courtroom family, many of whom had quietly doubted her capacity to lead, to endure, or to outmaneuver the new generation's ambition, were now forced to reconsider every assumption they had ever made about her. In one calculated offensive, she had exposed lies, dismantled alliances, and proven that wisdom, experience, and a razor-sharp sense of strategy were still forces to be feared, even revered. Board members who had once whispered behind her back, suggesting she had grown too old, too bitter, or too disconnected, now found themselves silently nodding with admiration and, for some, even fear. Tracy had not just defended her name, she had elevated it. She had made it clear that no matter how many times people attempted to bury her beneath political maneuvering or emotional betrayal, she would always rise, sharper than before, like steel that had been forged in fire. But beyond the applause of the boardroom, beyond the headlines now circulating throughout Port Charles, what mattered most to Tracy was something far deeper. She had restored the part of herself that had been most wounded, the part that believed in fairness, in strength over submission, in holding wrongdoers accountable even when the world begged for silence. For months, she had been treated like a relic, an inconvenient remnant of a more ruthless era. Now she stood as a living monument to that ruthlessness, to a code that believed justice was not something to passively wait for, but something to pursue, corner, and wrestle to the ground if necessary. She had not begged for vindication. She had demanded it, and she had won. And she knew this victory came at a cost. The trust of family members who had chosen not to stand with her, the image of Carly's face crumbling under the weight of betrayal being brought to light, the sound of Michael's silence as he walked away from the woman who raised him, those echoes would remain. But Tracy had no regrets. She did not seek comfort in family dinners or platitudes of forgiveness. She sought truth. She sought accountability. And she had delivered both with ruthless clarity. In her world, forgiveness was earned, not given freely. She had forgiven in the past, often too easily, often in the name of family unity or nostalgia. But this time had been different. This time, the betrayal had cut deeper because it was laced with manipulation and cowardice. And she had chosen not to let it go unpunished. There was a fire inside her, one that had burned quietly for years, dimmed by compromise and sentimentality. That fire had now erupted into full force, consuming everything that stood in its path. To the outside world, she might have looked like a woman in her twilight years, clutching desperately to a seat of power that had long since moved on. But in truth, Tracy had never been more alive, more dangerous, or more certain of who she was. She was not a relic, she was a reminder. A reminder that the Courtroom legacy had not gone soft, that it had not succumbed to the messy entanglements of modern alliances and emotional entitlements. She was a Courtroom of the old world, merciless, calculating, brilliant, and for once, the entire town of Port Charles had been forced to remember what that truly meant. Tracy walked away from the courthouse steps not with vengeance in her eyes, but with a fire that dared anyone to come for her again. She had survived exile, disgrace, prison, and silence, and she had turned every wound into a weapon. The message she left behind was unmistakable: those who dared to betray her would not only fall but would be crushed under the weight of their own schemes. Her path forward was now wide open, not paved with forgiveness, but with control. And she would walk it unapologetically, her heels echoing against marble floors, her eyes always forward, never looking back. Justice, for Tracy, was not blind. It was watchful. It was brutal. And above all, it was hers to wield.